Welcome to the first in a series of online talks called The Quilt in Focus. My name is Judith. I'm with an organisation called Queer Culture Ireland, and I'm here in collaboration with Dublin LGBT Pride running these talks today. We're in the beautiful surroundings of Outhouse, so I'd like to thank the people at Outhouse and our partners Dublin LGBT Pride for making this all happen. And today we're starting with something very special. It's a discussion around the Diceman, also known as Tom McGinty. Tom was a street performer in Dublin and also an LGBT and political activist in Dublin in the 1980s and 90s. Tom was diagnosed with AIDS in 1990 and became quite active in the AIDS activism side of things too. He was a man of huge, imposing presence, fantastic talent in what he did, and an amazing sense of honesty about his world. He gave the LGBT community a presence in the centre of Grafton Street, at the heart of the city, at a time when it was actually a criminal act to be gay in Ireland. He was so beloved that when he was diagnosed with AIDS, the Dublin community came together and supported him during this time. And today I have with me one of Tom's closest friends, Aidan Murphy, and he's going to talk to us about Tom's life and his memories of Tom. Thanks so much for joining us, Aidan. How are you?
No problem, delighted to be here.
Thank you so much. So I guess a lot of people are going to be watching this, some who, like myself, remember Tom from the streets of Dublin, others who may have just heard the name or may not know of him at all. So let's start by just talking about who he was and how he started in this whole world of performance.
Okay, well, Tom was Glaswegian, although he regarded himself as an Irishman, having spent a lot of his childhood summers in Baldinglass in Wicklow. And he came over to Ireland in 1976, and he'd had a background in Scotland in the theatre and in life modelling. So he came over to Ireland, or over to Dublin for, he had a job lined up in NCAD, but it didn't materialise straight away. So he found himself without any funds. So he went to the old Dandelion Market, which is where the Stephen's Green shopping centre roughly will be now, up in Stephen's Green. And he dressed himself up in a costume and makeup, and he had a bowl, and it said something to the effect of "in love with the country but can't afford to stay here." And people would put money into his bowl, and he'd give them a wink. And I think when he became a bit more confident, he stood up. I think he started off sitting down. And from that time at that time he was known as the Dandelion Clown. He got his name from the place. When he was becoming known as the Diceman, the way that came about, in the early 80s he was working for a shop to advertise a shop called the Diceman. It was a games shop, and it had various locations, but all on Grafton Street or very near to Grafton Street, the South Ann Street area. And at one stage I remember he was performing, I think, at Fifth Avenue. There was a little arcade, and he would gather a huge crowd around him, and it would block up the street a bit. Yeah. So the guards told him he had to move. He couldn't just stand still, he had to move. And that's how his famous slow walk developed. So thank you, Gardaí.
You've mentioned that to me before, that quite often when he was on the street he was attacked or people would try to antagonise him. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I suppose when you're putting yourself out there in the street, I mean, when Tom was out there, he was the most visible person in the whole street. I mean, if you can imagine a Grafton Street thronged, and there was this guy, and he was the focus of attention. And I suppose when you put yourself up like that, you're going to get all sorts of reaction. I mean, most people will stop and stare, and then they might get a wink, and that's fine. But you know, some people would get very antagonistic, and you know, sometimes you'd get a bit of aggression. People would throw things at times. In the early years he used to perform barefoot, and he told me that people would throw down lit butts, cigarette butts, and he said he'd feel the heat just before he stood, and he'd just move his foot. and he was not very often, but it's not the type of thing you want to happen. He was set on fire on more than one occasion, and that could be one time too many.
It's incredibly brave to do this type of street performance where you're putting yourself out there.
Gosh, yeah.
With so little protection, and the idea that people are trying to attack you and all that. But certainly from my perspective, one of the things I adore about Tom is that he was quite an openly gay man, and a lot of his performance was around LGBT activism and making those statements. I wonder, as a person who knew him, obviously, was he openly gay about that, and was he, somebody who didn't try to hide that side of himself? Certainly it came across in his performance, obviously.
Yeah, no, Tom, he was a very larger than life character in every way, and I remember when we were in the flat in the 70s Tom was, I think we were there only a short while, and he told us that he was a gay man, and he wouldn't have made any bones about it, but he was very larger than life in all, in his voice, in his appearance, everything, and it's not something he would have tried to hide. And I think he really put himself out there, especially when he was out performing on the street.
Yeah,
and must have had I think it did have a big influence on everybody, on gay people and straight people, but for gay people to see somebody put himself out there and so visible. And he did become quite famous, he was very openly gay, absolutely.
Now, like I said, I just love the idea that at a time when, it was basically criminal act to be openly gay, that here was this beautiful, beloved man in the centre of Grafton Street, and very proud to be gay, and quite camp in the way he had costumes made, and that presence that he had. A lot of what he did was, obviously, there was early theatre and the street performance piece, and you mentioned that a lot of that was commercial, but there was also a different side to his performance, the political and the LGBT activism side. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, if Tom was, he got commissions for most of his costumes, but if something was going on or something that he felt strongly about, he would go out and make a statement by performing. And one of the performance pieces he did, he made up this costume called what he called the bloody visual, and it was basically a white gown spattered in blood, and then to mimic that on his face, he would have a white makeup and bloodied eye and maybe his blood on the face, and quite artistically done, but it would make a point.
Over this side, Aidan, we have a fantastic selection of costumes. These are most of the ones that you brought today for us to see. And I know you mentioned that a lot of these at the top were more the commercial side of what Tom was working in. So you want to briefly tell us a little bit about those?
I think the one we have behind you here, we made a number of variations on this one. Tom would have been very influenced by Japanese colour in the visual sense, and these costumes and even some of the makeup. So we made a number of these costumes that did very dramatic arm pieces hanging down. Generally speaking, it might have been for Oki Computers or Japan. I think they were a fashion shop, were they? Japan. Something that had an Eastern or Japanese connection. And I think we alluded to the purple suit earlier on. That was casual wear. I can't remember exactly what this one was for. Again, I think with the squares and triangles and circles. Again, I think it might have had a Japanese connection. This one here was one of the costumes that Tom made that he wore for Bewley's. He was a wizard. There was a pointed hat to go with that, and he would have done a lot of work for Bewley's over the, I think I remember him once, we made up this big huge brack, and there was a big bite taken out of it, and Tom was Dracula after taking the bite out of the brack, and we had him in an egg costume for Easter again for Bewley. So there was a lot of work for Bewley's around that time. The other costume up there is part of a Valentine's Day costume, and then this one behind me here was from the infamous Rocky Horror promotion. There was a show, a Rocky Horror show, to be staged in the SFX in Dublin, and it's a venue that no longer exists. But Tom was employed anyway to promote this on the street, and in line with the show, he wore a very risque costume, which involved the basque here, a big feather kind of headpiece, and fishnet stockings, and he allegedly bared his buttocks, and this is how he fell foul of the law.
We're standing in front of the AIDS Memorial Quilt, or it was originally called the Names Project when it first started off, and the panel down here is the one that's dedicated to the Diceman. I really like this one, just on a personal level, because he's depicted as Dracula, and I mentioned this to you, Aidan, that my uncle is Paddy Dracula, and I knew that they were friends, and I met him briefly through that. So do you want to tell us a little bit about his Dracula days?
Yeah, this was a very popular character. I think I can't remember how he did it or why he did it at first, but it was hugely popular for entertainment, where you weren't. Sometimes it was used for promotions, but it would tend to be if he was going to a festival and just for pure entertainment. But you might get a sense of it, a little sense of it here. That's a reasonable rendition, and it was fairly scary looking. And I remember a few times it kind of I mean, obviously that was part of the appeal, because when he was doing this, if he was in a huge crowded setting, instead of, he might wink at people, but what he'd do is he'd find somebody and he'd run after them, and pretend to bite their neck or something like this, and there'd be screams and pandemonium, and a great laugh.
Tragically, obviously, the reason he has a panel is that Tom was diagnosed with HIV.
Yeah.
Do you recall when that was?
Yeah, I think it was if I remember rightly, I think Tom wanted us to insure ourselves against injury or whatever. I can't remember the exact nature of the insurance, but both of us were required to take an AIDS test, and unfortunately Tom's came back positive, and that was in 1990, I think, and it was a huge shock. I mean, as you can imagine, I think he had suspicions, and he had mentioned it to me before. He had suspicions that there was a possibility he could be HIV, but it's one thing, suspecting, and another thing for it to come back in writing. And when he was diagnosed in 1990, he was in reasonably good health, and he stayed in reasonably good health for a few years, but unfortunately I think in 1993 he very suddenly, as it appeared to me, his behaviour changed very suddenly, and we later discovered that he was suffering from atrophy of the brain, which afflicts some people who have AIDS. I was definitely featured in the recent TV show It's a Sin, where one of the characters, it was the first time I'd ever seen any other character, I'd known anybody else being portrayed with this condition. And it basically, it's like a type of dementia, and it affects your behaviour. So once that kicked in with Tom, he went from a very gradual decline and reasonably good health, not 100%, but then he went into rapid decline, and I'd say within a matter of weeks, I'd say almost straight away, he wasn't able to do his Diceman routine. One of the things I noticed, he lost the focus, that look, that steely look. He lost that almost immediately, and he wouldn't have been aware. There's that kind of, I forget what you call it, and they alluded to it as well in the show It's a Sin, that the person doesn't know what it's proper to do in all sorts of ways, from a safety point of view, from hygiene, legally. It's like Tom at the time. I remember one time, I think he was still driving. We were trying to work out a way to stop him driving because we didn't think it was safe. And the doctors would say to him, Tom, if you don't feel well, you're not to drive. And he would come out and say, I feel fine, there's nothing wrong with me. Because in his own head, he would think, I'm okay, I feel okay. And when he, at a certain stage in October of 2004, he appeared on the Late Late Show, and he spoke about his illness, and he was very ill himself at that stage, and very, very impressive. I really couldn't believe it at the time how he pulled everything together, because the atrophy had really affected him at that stage, and yet he was able to sit up there and talk, not only talk to Gay Byrne at the time, but he was able to talk to the nation. And I remember on a number of occasions he spoke to the camera, he spoke to everybody in the country, and asked people if they could, told people that they could ring him and talk to him if they had any concerns. And he's very, very impressive, really.
Yeah, hugely impressive. I mean, that Late Late Show appearance is extremely moving and extremely brave. For exactly that, he talks so openly and honestly about his illness, and then he reaches out and offers support for anyone who's going through it.
And he's very visibly ill in it. You can
definitely.
See, anybody can see.
But also, what's nice is at the start of that Late Late Show appearance, he comes in with a crown and the cloak that's behind you there, and that was in relation to a tribute event that had been run just before that. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I think it was just before, in October of 1994. I think it was Susie Kennedy's instigation, and she did some sterling work in putting that together. We set up a benefit for Tom, because at that stage he could no longer work, and we just wanted to have some financial security for him, so that this something he didn't need to worry about. None of us needed to worry about. And Susie very kindly took that on and put together this great event where a number of performers entertained us for the night. It was a fancy dress ball, everybody dressed up, and at the end of it all, Tom wore this costume, this cloak behind us. I'll tell you where it came from in a minute. And Gavin Friday very kindly crowned him the king of the High King of the street performers. And it was a lovely event. It was great fun. It was a lovely event. And it was nice to honour somebody when they're still in the land of the living. And he really enjoyed it. We couldn't get him off the stage at the end. But the costume here, this unusual looking cloak, Tom loved this costume. And it came from Russia. We had, in 1989, when he was in South Carolina performing in Salome, around that time the Berlin Wall fell, and roll on a few years, in 1993, we worked for an Irish company who had a joint venture with the Russian state. I think they were a telecommunications company, and somebody came up with the great idea of having a Paddy's Day parade in Moscow. So somebody else piped up and said, let's get the Diceman over there. So over we went, and in the same parade there was these horsemen called the Kabardinians. I think it was in connection with the place where they came from. Anyway, the Kabardinians were horsemen, and they wore this cloak on their shoulders, and when Tom saw this, he had to have one. Just had to have one.
So obviously Tom passed away then February 20th of February. That's right, 1995, yeah. And this event, us putting this out today, is actually to mark his anniversary. Do you have any last memories of Tom that you'd like to share just before we finish?
When you think even back a few years before, when Vincent Hanley died, there was a shroud of secrecy about, and it must have been terribly difficult for that man. There's this shroud of secrecy about the whole thing. Tom McGinty died from AIDS publicly acknowledged it, and he was, when he did die, he lived with AIDS first, and when he did die, he was carried, his coffin was carried from the very top of Grafton Street all the way down by an army of his friends. We started off with 6 people, 6 pallbearers at the top of Grafton Street. They would walk maybe 10 metres, and 6 more people took him home. And then, so we all carried him down the street, and outside Bewley's, halfway down, there was a big spontaneous round of applause.
I'm going to just finish. I have a quote here, and it's from the obituary that Dermot Bulger wrote for Tom in 1995. So just to read this out to you, because I think it's really lovely. And it says, "He was our king, the king of everyone ever called a faggot or queer or weirdo or blow-in, of everyone who ever dared to truly be themselves, and even those too scared to try. Of everyone eccentric or outcast or different, he was the high king of all the diversity without which any society cannot grow." Nicely said.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much, Aidan, for your time and for bringing all your costumes. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Judith.
Thank you.
You're welcome.